At 15, Eli Mercer had two options: freeze outside or disappear into a mountain. People who laughed were begging to come indoors by winter. This is the Zelly Ancient Shelter, March 1931 in Harlan County, Kentucky. Most boys his age were still sleeping in their parents' homes, eating meals they hadn't earned, and dreaming of futures that seemed assured. But 15-year-old Eli Mercer was standing at the mouth of an abandoned coal prospect with only a canvas sack and the clothing on his back. The entrance to the mine looked like a hole in the hillside, dark and neglected, surrounded by scrub oak and the rusting remains of tools that were left behind when the seam ran out. All the miners in the county knew about this place. They called it the Dead Drift, and felt only a fool would go inside. Eli went in anyhow. That morning his uncle made the problem very obvious while standing on the porch of the company house with his arms crossed and his jaw set hard. "You work like a woman, but eat like a male. I have 4 mouths to feed, and my mind is changing. You are out." The words hit hard and were definitive. Eli didn't fight back. He learned months ago that fighting with his uncle only resulted in bruising. His parents had perished in the previous summer's typhoid outbreak, 3 days apart, and the uncle who had unwillingly taken him in had made it obvious from the start that charity had limitations. The boarders had arrived. Eli traveled away from the only haven he had left and up the mountain to a site that everyone thought was worthless. If you want to learn how a homeless youth turned an abandoned mine shaft into something that made mature men reconsider all they knew about survival, subscribe to our channel and let me know where you're watching from. Because what Eli built inside that hill would shelter 3 generations of his family and still be standing nearly a century later. The Dead Drift had earned its moniker genuinely. Back in 1919, a little mining company excavated the tunnel into the mountainside to seek a coal seam that mapping surveys revealed would be rich and deep. They had reached around 80 feet in when the seam pinched off, leaving them with a horizontal shaft just 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, carved through solid sandstone and shale. The corporation had withdrawn, taken its equipment, and never looked back. The tunnel had become a local failure landmark over the past 12 years. A reminder that the hills did not always produce their bounty, no matter how hard you dug. Local boys dared each other to go inside. Hunters occasionally sheltered there during storms, but no one felt it was good for anything else. The entrance faced southeast, so it received morning sun but stayed shaded throughout the strong midday heat of Kentucky summers. The floor was dry, the walls were solid, and the inside temperature remained cool, even in August. Silas had discovered these things the previous fall, when he had hidden there for 3 days after his uncle had brutally beaten him, leaving marks that would have prompted worries at school. He'd been resting on the cold stone floor, watching the light change at the tunnel opening and wondering about the root cellars. His grandma used to describe how people stored food underground, as the earth kept things cool in the summer and warm in the winter. His grandmother grew up in the Old World, in the mountains of Eastern Europe, where people had lived in caves and dugouts for thousands of years. Sheedy told him stories about houses dug into hillsides, and families who withstood difficult winters by letting the land itself give shelter. When he was younger, the stories seemed like fairy tales. Now, standing at the mouth of the Dead Drift with nowhere else to go, they felt like instructions. The first week was the hardest. Eli had no tools, materials, money, or anyone available to aid him. The tunnel was dry but cold, and the March nights in eastern Kentucky still had enough frost to kill anyone who was unprepared. He collected dead leaves and pine needles and stacked them against the tunnel walls to offer insulation. He spotted a rusty sheet of corrugated metal half buried in the slag pile outside and brought it into the tunnel to establish a windbreak just inside the entrance. He ate anything he could find, generally early spring greens and the leftovers of a discarded lunch pail he unearthed beside the train lines. The hunger was continual, a profound throbbing that never went away, yet he was awake and thinking. The tunnel had one significant advantage, which Eli instantly grasped. The granite itself maintained a consistent temperature of 55 all year. He remembered his grandma telling how the ground below the frost line stayed consistent in temperature, regardless of the weather above. In the winter, 55 was warmer than any unheated cabin. In the heat, it was cooler than any shade. As you moved deeper into the slope, the temperature became more steady. The dead drift went 80 feet into the mountain. At the back of the tube, the air was entirely still, extremely temperate, completely consistent. The challenge was making the home livable. Eli required light, ventilation, and a means to generate heat other than what the earth offered. He required a floor that wasn't bare rock, walls that could store shelves and hooks, and a cooking space that didn't fill the tunnel with smoke. In brief, he needed to convert a failed mining enterprise into a dwelling. He had no money or materials. What he had was time, desperation, and recollections of his grandmother's stories of how people survived with nothing but the earth and their own two hands. The work started slowly, restricted by Eli's lack of tools and resources. He began by clearing the tunnel of rubbish, including loose rock, coal dust, and broken timbers that had collected over the course of 12 years of neglect. He carried each load outdoors by hand, creating a mound that he separated into categories: rock that could be exploited for construction, lumber that may still be sound, and metal fragments with possible worth. The sorting was laborious, but it taught him to see the possibilities in what others had disregarded. A broken pick handle transformed into a digging tool. A piece of rail spike was transformed into a chisel. A broken piece of canvas tarp became the start of a door. The village learned that the Mercer youngster was living in the dead drift. The reactions were predictable. Several individuals laughed. A few people showed alarm, but it quickly evaporated when they realized it may involve taking action. Most just shrugged and went about their business. People get tougher as a result of severe conditions. And 1931 was shaping up to be the most awful year anyone could recall. The miners were reducing shifts. Families were departing. A 15-year-old orphan who preferred to live in a hole in the ground received no special attention. One individual, however, paid heed. Ezra Whitaker was 63 years old and had spent the last 40 years working in Harlan County's coal mines. He'd lost 2 fingers to a coal car coupling, most of his hearing 2 dynamite blasts, and any illusions about the justice of the world had been smashed by the day-to-day realities of underground labor. He had also studied more about stone, soil, and mountain dynamics than most engineers would in a lifetime of study. Ezra approached the dead drift one April afternoon, not to aid, but to study what type of fool might try to live there. What he discovered was Eli hammering away at the tunnel wall with a broken pick, seeking to extend a natural crevice in the rock that may function as a shelf. The boy had horrible technique. He was going to harm himself, bring down loose rock, or both. Ezra sat silent for a few minutes, his arms folded, then he went forward, taking Eli's selection. "You're cutting against the grain," Ezra explained. "Sun's layers are like wood. You work with them, not against them." He exhibited 3 exact strokes that opened the fissure cleanly. Just like that. See, Eli saw. Ezra spent the next hour teaching him how to read the granite, detect natural fracture patterns, and use the stone's intrinsic structure to shape it rather than fighting it. He did not offer to help with the project. He did not exhibit approval or encouragement. He just transmitted knowledge in the same manner that you would educate someone to sharpen a knife or mend a fence. Because understanding how to perform something flawlessly was better than seeing someone do it incorrectly. "This tunnel is robust," Ezra commented as he prepared to leave. "The corporation gave up too soon. Seems to be still there, but shifted. But the surrounding stone is high-quality sandstone. If you exercise caution, it will not collapse. It won't leak if you seal it properly." He gazed at Eli with eyes that had seen too much to waste time on feelings. "Your strategy is unlikely to be effective. However, if it does, it will not be luck. It will be because you have learned the rock." He walked away and did not return for 3 weeks. Spring progressed into summer, and the dead drift began to alter. Eli worked constantly, taking odd jobs in town when he could find them, and devoting every spare hour to his underground dwelling. He acquired a reputation for dependability by showing up when he said he would, working until the job was completed, and never moaning about chores that others thought beneath them. The money he made was spent purely on materials, nails and hinges, and a few hand tools. The very minimum required to transform raw potential into something usable. The tunnel floor witnessed its first considerable improvement in late May. Eli had been collecting flat stones from a stream bed 2 miles distant and dragging them back in a sack weighing 50 or 60 pounds at a time. He placed them across the tunnel floor, fitting them together like puzzle pieces and filling any holes with sand and small rocks. The task took 3 weeks of stolen time, but when it was completed, he had a dry, level, and immaculate floor. You could walk the entire 80 feet without falling over rocks or sliding into muck. It was a little win, but it felt big. The ventilation problem corrected itself in an unexpected manner. While cleaning trash from the tunnel's rear, Eli discovered a natural fissure in the ceiling that led upward into the rock. He could feel a constant, delightful draft on his face as he stood beneath it. The crack was too narrow to see daylight through, but it connected to the surface somewhere above. This was passive ventilation. His grandma remembers the same principle in her childhood underground dwellings. Cool air entered the bottom tunnel mouth, warmed somewhat as it passed through the living space, and rose naturally through the opening in the rear. The tunnel breathed. Smoke from a tiny fire would float to the back and disappear upward. Stale air never gathered. The earth had supplied its own remedy, and Eli had only been fortunate, or industrious, enough to uncover it. Ezra Whitaker returned in early June, bringing a bundle covered in cloth. He opened it without ceremony, exposing a set of equipment that made Eli's breath catch: a true rock chisel, a tiny sledgehammer, a level, and a plumb line. These were vintage tools, worn smooth from decades of wear, yet they were sound, sharp, and far better than anything Eli had been working with. "Mine now that I'm retired," Ezra said angrily. "Sitting in my shed doing nothing. Figured they might as well be useful." Eli began to thank him, but Ezra cut him short. "Don't. I'm not being generous. I'm being practical. You're going to keep working on this fool project whether I help or not. Might as well work with proper tools so you don't kill yourself." He spent the afternoon teaching Eli how to use each tool correctly, how to maintain the edges, and how to work stone efficiently without wasting effort. Before he left, he walked the length of the tunnel, examining the laid floor, the cleared walls, and the natural ventilation crack. "Not bad," he admitted, which from Ezra Whitaker was equivalent to high praise. "You've got the right instincts. You just need to know more." He returned every few weeks after that, never announcing his visits, just appearing at the tunnel mouth with some new piece of knowledge to share. How to mix mortar that would bond to sandstone, how to frame a door opening in solid rock, how to calculate load-bearing requirements for a stone shelf. Each lesson was delivered without sentiment, without unnecessary conversation, and Eli absorbed them all. By late summer, the dead drift had become something that no longer matched its name. The entrance now featured a proper door frame, built from salvaged lumber and fitted with hinges that Eli had traded 3 days of fence mending to acquire. The door itself was made from planks he'd rescued from a collapsed barn, sanded smooth and weatherproofed with linseed oil. It opened into a vestibule of sorts, a transitional space where the natural rock walls had been smoothed, and a small window, really just a glass pane set into a wooden frame, let in natural light. Beyond the vestibule, the main living space extended 30 feet into the hillside. Stone shelves lined the walls at varying heights, carved directly from the rock where possible, and built from stacked flat stones, where the natural structure didn't cooperate. A sleeping platform occupied one wall, raised off the floor on stone supports, sized for a straw mattress that Eli had sewn himself from burlap sacks and stuffed with dried corn husks. The back of the tunnel, where the temperature was most stable, served as food storage. Here, Sinus had built a crude root cellar within a root cellar, a stone-lined alcove where vegetables and preserved food could keep for months without spoiling. The constant 55 temperature meant that potatoes wouldn't freeze in winter or sprout too quickly in spring. Apples stored there in September would still be edible in March. Meat properly cured would last indefinitely. But the real engineering triumph was the heating system. Eli had studied the problem for months, watching how smoke behaved and learning from Ezra about thermal mass and heat retention. The solution he developed drew directly from his grandmother's stories, though he didn't have a name for what he was building until years later when he read about similar systems used in Korea and China for centuries. He called it simply the warm floor. The principle was elegant. rather than heating the air directly, which would simply rise to the ceiling and dissipate. Sinus built a channel system beneath the section of his stone floor. Smoke and hot gases from a small firebox traveled through these channels, heating the stones above them before exiting through a chimney pipe that connected to the natural ventilation crack at the back of the tunnel. The stones absorbed the heat and released it slowly, radiating warmth upward into the living space for hours after the fire died. The mass of stone involved roughly 3 tons in the floor section alone, plus the thermal mass of the surrounding earth, created a system with enormous heat retention. Silas could fire the system for 2 hours in the evening using a fraction of the wood a traditional cabin would require, and the floor would stay warm until morning. Combined with the Earth's natural 55 baseline, his underground home could maintain 65 to 70 through a Kentucky winter on less than a cord of wood per season. The system's first real test came in December 1931. A cold front dropped temperatures across Harlan County to 15 below zero, the coldest night in 20 years. Families huddled around stoves, burning through firewood reserves that were supposed to last until March. The mining company's houses, built cheap and insulated poorly, turned into iceboxes. Children slept in their coats. Old people who couldn't afford enough fuel simply didn't wake up. Ezra Whitaker walked up to the dead drift that night, genuinely worried about what he might find. The boy had worked hard. Yes, he'd built something impressive, certainly, but theory and reality were different things, and 15 below zero didn't care about ingenuity. It killed without prejudice. Ezra found Eli sitting comfortably on his sleeping platform, reading a borrowed book by the light of an oil lamp. The temperature inside the tunnel was 6.2. The warm floor system had been fired 6 hours earlier and was still radiating steady heat. The stone walls, which had absorbed warmth all autumn and fall, contributed their own thermal mass to the equation. The natural insulation of the earth, equivalent to several feet of the best man-made insulation available, kept the cold from penetrating. Outside, it was cold enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. Inside, Eli was comfortable in shirt sleeves. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long moment, not speaking. Then he walked the length of the tunnel, touching the walls, feeling the floor, and checking the temperatures at different points with the back of his hand, his old miner's trick for gauging heat. At the back storage area, where preserved vegetables sat in stone alcoves, the temperature was a perfect 53. Nothing would freeze. Nothing would spoil. This was better climate control than any ice house or cold storage facility in the county. How much wood did you use? Ezra asked finally. About 20 pounds, Eli said. Fired it this morning, and again around supper time. 20. That was perhaps 4 or 5 good-sized logs. Families in town were burning 5 times that amount every few hours, and still freezing. Ezra sat down heavily on the stone bench near the entrance. He'd spent 40 years in the mines. 40 years of brutal, dangerous, exploitative labor that had broken his body and stolen his health. He'd seen technology advance and working conditions stay terrible. Fortunes were seen made from coal while miners' families went hungry. And here was a 15-year-old orphan with no formal education who debuilt a home more efficient than anything the mining companies provided using materials that cost almost nothing. The company houses, Ezra said slowly. They could have built them like this, partially underground, with thermal mass heating, using the earth instead of fighting it. Why didn't they? Eli asked. Because it's easier to cut corners when you're building for other people. Because above-ground construction is faster, even if it's worse. Because the men in charge never had to live in what they built. Ezra shook his head. You've done something here, boy. Something they told us couldn't be done. The word spread slowly at first, then faster. As the winter ground on, people came to see the dead drift. Skeptical at first, then curious, then genuinely impressed. They walked through the tunnel, felt the warm floor, and examined the stone shelving and the ventilation system and the insulated door. Most of them left shaking their heads, not in disbelief anymore, but in something closer to wonder. A few asked questions. Eli answered them all just as Ezra had answered his. In February, a family named Hoskins approached Eli with an unusual request. They'd lost their company house when the father was injured in a mine collapse and could no longer work. They were living in a tent at the edge of town with 3 children under 8 years old, and the cold was killing them slowly. There was another abandoned prospect drift on the next ridge over, smaller than the dead drift, but structurally sound. Would Eli consider helping them turn it into a home? Eli agreed without hesitation. He and Ezra spent 4 weeks working on the Hoskins Tunnel, teaching the father and the oldest son as they went. The result wasn't as sophisticated as Eli's home, but it was warm, dry, and safe. The Hoskins family moved in before the last snow melted, and they were still living there 5 years later, when better times finally came. The second tunnel home led to a third, then a fourth. Each project taught Eli something new: refinements to the heating system, better methods for weatherproofing, and improvements to ventilation and lights. By 1935, there were 11 underground homes in Harlan County. All of them are variations on the original dead drift design. All of them were occupied by families who had nowhere else to go. The county called them dugouts at first, a term meant to be dismissive. Then they called them Combs houses with grudging respect. Eventually they were simply homes as legitimate and permanent as any other structure in the region. The mining companies took notice. Though their response was predictable, they couldn't allow their workers to believe that alternatives existed, that life was possible outside the company's control. A delegation of company men visited Eli in the fall of 1934 when he was 18 years old and offered him a proposition. They would pay him a substantial sum to stop building underground homes and to discourage others from the practice. Housing, they explained, was the company's domain. Independent shelter undermined the system. Eli listened politely, then declined. The company men left angry, but they didn't return. By then, there were too many Mercer houses in the hills. Too many families who'd learned the techniques, and too many people who understood that the earth could shelter them without the company's permission. The knowledge had spread beyond any single person's control. Eli Mercer lived in the original dead drift for 31 years, expanding and improving it until the tunnel extended over 150 feet into the hillside with multiple rooms, proper plumbing, and electric lighting. He married in 1938, raised 4 children in the underground home, and taught all of them the building techniques he'd developed as a desperate teenager. His wife, Margaret, initially skeptical about living in a cave, came to love the constant temperature, the quiet, and the sense of security that stone walls provided. She said it felt like being held by the mountain, protected from a world that had shown her precious little protection elsewhere. Ezra Whitaker lived long enough to see 12 Mercer houses built in Harlan County. He died in 1942, aged 74, having passed along every piece of knowledge he possessed about stone and earth and the patient craft of working with materials rather than against them. Eli spoke at his funeral, one of only 4 people who attended. He taught me that the earth wants to help us. Eli said, if we're smart enough to let it. He taught me that proper tools and proper technique matter more than strength or speed. He taught me that knowledge shared is worth more than knowledge kept. The dead drift itself passed to Eli's oldest son in 1966, when Eli and Margaret finally moved to a small house in town, their bones tired of climbing the mountain path. The son made his own improvements, adding insulation techniques that hadn't existed in 1931, upgrading the heating system, and modernizing the entrance. He raised his own children there, and his grandchildren visited every summer, sleeping in the cool darkness of the earth, while the Kentucky heat blazed outside. The tunnel is still there today, still occupied, still maintained by Silas Mercer's descendants. The warm floor system that a desperate 15-year-old improvised from his grandmother's stories and an old miner's guidance still functions and still heats the space on a fraction of the fuel that conventional homes require. The food storage area still holds vegetables through winter and apples through spring, the same way it did 90 years ago. Modern energy audits have measured the home's efficiency, and the numbers confirm what Silas knew by instinct. The thermal mass of the earth properly utilized provides heating and cooling that no mechanical system can match for cost or reliability. The lesson of the dead drift extends far beyond one boy's survival story. It speaks to something fundamental about human ingenuity and the resources we overlook when we're too busy following conventional paths. Silas Coombs had nothing, literally nothing, When he walked into that abandoned mine shaft, no money, no tools, no skills, no support. What he had was observation, patience, and the willingness to learn from anyone who would teach him. He looked at something everyone else saw as worthless, a failed mine, a hole in the ground, and recognized a possibility that others had missed. The earth itself became his ally, providing insulation, temperature, stability, and protection that no above-ground structure could match. The waste materials of an extractive industry, the abandoned tunnels, and the discarded equipment became the foundation of something sustainable and lasting. What the mining companies built quickly and cheaply, exploiting workers and land alike, fell apart within decades. What a teenage orphan built slowly and carefully, working with the earth rather than against it, still stands. There's a metaphor there, if you want one, about the difference between extraction and stewardship, about the value of knowledge, freely shared versus knowledge hoarded for profit, about what happens when we stop asking, "What can I take?" and start asking, "What can I build?" Silas Combs never became famous. He never wrote a book or gave lectures or sought recognition for what he'd accomplished. He simply lived his life, raised his family, and helped his neighbors when they needed help. The 11 Mercer houses he built or supervised in Harlan County sheltered over 6 families through the worst years of the Depression, providing warmth and stability when the official systems had failed completely. Most of those homes are gone now, reclaimed by the forest or demolished for more conventional development. But the knowledge survives, passed from Eli to his children, to their children, and now to anyone willing to listen to the story. The earth is still there, still maintaining its constant temperature, still offering shelter to anyone patient enough to learn how to work with it. So, here's the question for you. What abandoned space exists in your own life? What failed prospect or discarded resource has everyone else written off as worthless? And what might happen if you looked at it the way Silas Mercer looked at the dead drift? Not as a dead end, but as a beginning. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about survival, resourcefulness, or the wisdom hidden in forgotten traditions, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, persistence, and the willingness to see possibility where others saw only failure. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't the one that's given to you. Sometimes it's the one you carve out of the earth with your own 2 hands.